Natural selection is about the differential survival of coded information which has power to influence its probability of being replicated, which pretty much means genes. Coded information which has the power to make copies of itself, replicator, whenever that comes into existence in the universe, it potentially could be the basis for some kind of Darwinian selection. When that happens, you then have the opportunity for this extraordinary phenomenon which we call life. My conjecture is that if there's life elsewhere in the universe, it will be Darwinian life. I think there's only one way for this hyper-complex phenomenon which we call life to arise from the laws of physics. The laws of physics just let you know, if you throw a stone up in the air, it describes a parabola, and that's it. But biology, without ever violating the laws of physics, does the most extraordinary things. It produces machines which can run and walk and fly and dig and swing through the trees and think and produce the whole of human technology, human art, human music. This all comes about because at some point in history, about 4 billion years ago, a replicating entity arose. Not a gene as we would now see it, but something functionally equivalent to a gene, which, because it had the power to replicate and the power to influence its own probability of replicating, and replicated with slight errors, gave rise to the whole of life. If you ask me what my ambition would be, it would be that everybody would understand what an extraordinary, remarkable thing it is that they exist in a world which would otherwise just be plain physics. The key to the process is self-replication. The key to the process is that, let's call them genes, because nowadays they pretty much all are genes. Genes have a different probability of surviving. The ones that survive, because they have such high fidelity replication, are the ones which we see in the world, the ones which dominate gene pools in the world. So for me, the replicator, the gene, DNA, is absolutely key to the whole process of Darwinian natural selection. So when you ask the question, what about group selection, what about higher levels of selection, what about different levels of selection, everything comes down to gene selection. Gene selection is fundamentally what is really going on. Now, originally, these replicating entities would have been floating free and just replicating in the primeval soup, or whatever that was. But they discovered a technique of ganging together into huge robot vehicles, which we call individual organisms. So an individual organism is a unit of selection in a different sense from the replicator being a unit of selection. The replicator is a unit of selection which strictly is the thing that becomes either more numerous or less numerous in the world. Nowadays we say more numerous or less numerous in the gene pool, and that's modern post-Darwinian language. But because the individual organism is such a salient unit in which these replicators, these genes, have ganged up together, we as biologists tend to see the individual organism as the unit of action. The individual organism is the thing that has legs and wings, it has eyes, it has teeth, it has instincts. It's the thing that actually does something. And so it's natural for biologists to phrase their questions of purpose, of pseudo-purpose, at the level of the organism. They see the organism as striving for something, working for something, struggling to achieve something. What's it struggling to achieve? Well, for Darwin it was struggling to achieve survival and reproduction. Nowadays we would say it's struggling to achieve replication of the genes inside it. And this all comes about because well, one way of putting it, and I've often put it like this, is to say, look backwards at the ancestors of all modern animals, of any animal at any time. And you can say that all its ancestors, you can say that the individual is descended from an unbroken line of successful ancestors, an unbroken line of individuals which succeeded in surviving and reproducing. And what that really means is succeeded in passing on the genes that built them. So we are conduits for the genes that pass through us. We're temporary survival machines. Everything about biology can be understood in this way. Everything about biology can be understood if you say that what's really going on is differential replicator survival, gene survival in gene pools, and the way in which they do it is by controlling phenotypes, and those phenotypes in practice are nearly always bundled up into these discrete bodies, individual organisms. So if ever there is a bundle of replicators, a bundle of genes, which passes on its genes to the next generation in a single propagule, we do that. We pass on our genes in sperms or eggs. That means that all the genes in a body, in a mammal body, in a vertebrate body, in an animal body, a normal animal with sexual reproduction, because all the genes in that body have the identical expectation of getting into future generations, namely leaving the present body in a sperm or an egg. That means that all the genes in a body are pulling for the same end. They all have the same, so to speak, goal. If they didn't, and some of them might not, viruses, for example, have a different goal of being sneezed out or being spat out or whatever it might be. And they, of course, are quite different, and they do not cooperate with the rest of the genes in the body. But all the genes that have the same expectation of the future, the same expectation of leaving the present body and getting into the next body, they cooperate. They work together. That's why bodies are such coherent wholes. That's why all the limbs and all the sense organs work together. It's simply because all the genes that built them have the same exit route to the next generation. The minority that don't, we call things like viruses, and they have a different exit route, and they don't cooperate, and they may kill you. So, although it's true that the great majority of survival machines are actually discrete organisms, that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. And if genes can influence phenotypes that are outside the body, then they will do so. And this is the extended phenotype. And the simplest sort of extended phenotype would be an artifact like a bird's nest. So a bird's nest is an organ. It's an organ in just the same sense as a heart or a kidney is an organ, but it just happens to be outside the body, and it happens to be made of grass and sticks rather than being made of the cells that contain the genes. But nevertheless, it's a phenotype which is produced by the animal's nervous system working through nest-building behavior, and it does exactly the same kind of thing, namely preserving the genes in the form of eggs and chicks as organs of the body like kidneys and livers and muscles. The next kind of extended phenotype that I've talked about is hosts of parasites, because there are these spectacular examples, which Dan Dennett is fond of quoting, for example, of parasites which influence their hosts in order to get into the next generation. And a host body to a parasite gene is like a bird's nest. It's influenced by the genes. We don't normally put it that way. We normally say that the parasite, the fluke or whatever it is, the whole fluke influences the whole snail to get itself passed on. But in fact, if you think at the genetic level, the genes are influencing the fluke's phenotype, which in turn influences the snail's phenotype. to enhance the propagation of the Fuchs genes into the next generation. So there's no reason to draw a line around the Fuchs body and say, well, outside that it's no longer proper phenotype. It is proper phenotype. It's just that you have to think outside the box, in this case outside the snail, in order to get the true relationship between genes and phenotypes. And then generalizing further, a cuckoo in a nest influences the behavior of its host by various stimuli, by having a bright red gape and squawking in the right way and so on. And once again, just as the fluke influences the snail to get itself passed on to the next generation, the cuckoo influences the reed warbler to get its genes passed on to the next generation. And the change in reed warbler behavior can properly be regarded as phenotypic expression of cuckoo genes. Now this is my vision of life. My vision of life is that everything stems from replicators, which are in practice DNA molecules on this planet. The replicators reach out into the world to influence their own probability of being passed on. Mostly they don't reach further than the individual body in which they sit. But that's a matter of practice, not a matter of principle. The individual organism can be defined as that set of phenotypic products which are produced by, which have a single route of exit of the genes into the future. That's not true of the cuckoo reed warbler case, but it is true of the ordinary animal body. So the organism, the individual organism, is a deeply salient unit. It's a unit of selection in the sense that I've called a vehicle. There are two kinds of unit of selection. The difference is a semantic one. They're both units of selection, but one is the replicator, and what it does is get itself copied. So more and more copies of itself go into the world. The other kind of unit is the vehicle. It doesn't get itself copied. What it does is work to copy the replicators which have come down to it through the generations and which is going to pass on to future generations. So we have this individual replicator dichotomy. They're both units of selection, but in different senses. It's important to understand that they are different senses. Now, because the individual organism is such a salient unit, biologists after Darwin got into the habit of seeing the organism as the unit of action, and therefore they asked the question, what is the organism maximizing? What mathematical function is the organism maximizing? Fitness is the answer. So fitness was coined as a mathematical expression of that which the organism is maximizing. But of course what fitness really is, or ought to be if we understand it properly, is gene survival. Now, for a long time, fitness was equated in people's minds with reproduction, with having a large number of children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. Bill Hamilton, and others, but mostly Bill Hamilton, realized that you had to generalize that, because if what's really going on is working to pass on genes, offspring, grandchildren, etc., are not the only ways of passing on genes. An organism can work to enhance the survival and reproduction of its siblings, its nephews, its nieces, its cousins, and so on. And Hamilton worked out the mathematics of that. I think it was unfortunate that Hamilton, having realized this very important insight, chose to stick with the individual organism as the entity of action. He therefore coined the phrase inclusive fitness, as the mathematical function which an individual organism will maximize if what it's really doing is maximizing its gene survival. It's a rather complicated thing to calculate. It's difficult to calculate in practice, and this has led to a certain amount of not hostility, but a certain amount of skepticism about inclusive fitness as a measure. Skepticism which I share, but for me the remedy to that skepticism is to say, well, forget about the organism and concentrate on the gene itself. Ask yourself, as Hamilton also did, ask yourself, if I were a gene, what would I do to maximize my propagation into the future? Hamilton did that, but he also, I think, laid in a sort of false trail, strictly correct but not helpful, by saying, if I'm an individual, what would I do to maximize my gene survival? Both ways of phrasing it are correct. They're both correct if you can get the calculation right, but one of them is rather harder to do. If you're trying to do intuitive Darwinism, if you're trying to work out what would you expect to happen in the world, I think it's better to ask the question, what would I do if I were a gene, rather than what would I do if I were an elephant. In both cases, this is a personification. Nobody really thinks that either genes or elephants scratch their heads and think, what would I do? But it's a useful trick, a useful dodge when you're trying to get the right answer. As, say, a field biologist in the Serengeti. It's a useful trick to say, what would I do if I was a? And you can fill in the end of that sentence by saying either if I was a gene or if I was an elephant. And you'll get the right answer if in the gene case you concentrate on self-replication, and if in the elephant case you concentrate on passing on genes. So we have these two logically equivalent ways of expressing what's going on in Darwinism. Both of them Hamilton used. There's the what would I do if I was a gene way of doing it, and there's the what would I do if I was an elephant or an aardvark way of doing it, and they're both correct. I think some of the opposition to Hamilton, which has recently surfaced, is because people have realized that inclusive fitness is not a very practical way of doing things. It's a difficult thing to calculate. And my suggestion would be, and I actually said this to Hamilton, my suggestion would be to abandon inclusive fitness and to concentrate instead on personification of the gene, and then you'll get the right answer. George C. Williams in 1966 wrote a brilliant book, Adaptation and Natural Selection, which sort of roughly the same time as Hamilton was working, and they both tumbled to the same truth, which is that what's really going on in natural selection is survival of genes. And Williams was eloquent on this. Williams said things like, Socrates may have had any number of children. We don't know that. But what really Socrates passed on, if he passed on anything, was genes. It's genes that pass through the generations. And so whenever you're talking about teleonomy, whenever you're talking about the pseudo purpose, which we see in life, what's it for? What's the adaptation for? Who benefits? Cui bono? Whenever you ask that question, you should be looking at the level of the gene.